Automobiles. In Texas, most automobiles should not be transferred to a trust. There is no administrative benefit because vehicle transfers go through the Department of Motor Vehicles, even if it's owned by a trust. Automobiles can avoid probate, but otherwise are a probate asset that can't be disposed of until letters testamentary or letters of administration are acquired through the probate process. The rules vary from state to state, so if you came from another state, the rules may be very different in your state. For classic cars, you might consider an automobile trust. Boats, like automobiles, boat transfers go through the Department of Motor Vehicles, even if they're owned by a trust. You can use the same procedure, but depending on the type and how that boat is used, consider having it owned by an LLC instead. If it's an ocean-going boat, you must also contact the U.S. Coast Guard and follow their procedures. Yachts and ships should be owned by a business entity. Now, years ago, I had a client that owned a yacht. We transferred that yacht into a business entity, and I told the family, no more free rides on the yacht. I'll never forget this lady looking at me, putting her hand on her hip and saying, and just where are we going to get the money to rent that yacht? I thought, lady, I think y'all have a money printing press in the back of your business. I said, you're going to rent it from your LLC. That's how it gets the revenue to pay the expenses, which become deductible business expenses. And when their CPA just realized that we had converted $400,000 of expenses into deductible business expenses, they got very excited. I was keenly disappointed because I realized we forgot to charge them for that tax plan. We also forgot to require that the lawyers get a cruise on the yacht. Never making either one of those mistakes again. Recreational vehicles, like automobiles, RV transfers go through the Department of Motor Vehicles, even if they're owned by the trust. You can use the same procedure, but these are higher risk assets from a liability viewpoint. Now, my parents, one time I think they were just trying to give me a heart attack, invited us over because they had bought a motorhome. They were surprised. I wasn't very excited about it. And I said, Mom and Dad, when I see those driving down the road, what I see is a vehicle with a great big neon sign on it that says, sue me. And my dad said, now we looked into this and we found 85% of the time when these are in accidents, the accident is caused by the other driver. I said, Dad, I'm sure you're right, but after that guy has swerved 17 times before he finally drives up under your vehicle and splatters himself all over the freeway, and he leaves a wife and 3 little kids. In the ensuing lawsuit, what takes place in the jury's mind when they see on one side this poor grieving widow and her 3 half-orphan children against these rich people with the motorhome? How does that go? And all of a sudden my parents were like, oh, I see what you mean. So we put it into an LLC, and I told them they weren't driving it until I got that done. They did insist on going to dinner that night in it. Now, consider having it owned by an LLC instead, and especially depending on how it's used. I know a guy who uses his RV in his business. The exotic rancher I went to, we actually drove out there in an RV with his insurance agent. Aircraft are complicated, and I don't just mean as tools. They're complicated to plan for. If it's owned for general aviation, you do not want the liability associated with commercial aviation. You can transfer it to the trust or a business entity, but you have to be careful. You have to file an assignment of aircraft and a certificate of registration vehicle with the FAA to issue a new certificate in the trust name. You file either an FAA Form 8100-2, Standard Airworthiness Certificate, or an FAA Form 8130-7, a Special Airworthiness Certificate. You also are going to have various maintenance records that include the total service time for the airframe, each engine, each propeller, the current status of the life limited parts like airframe, engine, propeller, rotor, appliances. There's a lot of stuff that you need to look at. The time since the last overhaul of each installed item requiring overhaul. Identification of current inspection status. And hopefully you're starting to see that this is complicated enough. It's why we might recommend a business entity. Current status of the applicable airworthiness directives. A copy of the current major alteration to each airframe, engine, propeller, rotor, and appliance, and maintenance records. And by the way, on experimental aircraft, you have even more things to consider.